Good evening, and very much thank you for coming. My name is Ivan Krastev, and I'm one of the permanent fellows here in the Institute for Human Sciences, so it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce the speakers and basically being part of the discussion. This discussion is slightly different, at least in its intention, than the normal political salons that you know that Institute for Human Sciences now for years are doing with the press, and we can be very happy with this. And the story is that we have a very interesting speaker. We have a very interesting speaker with a very interesting position, because if you don't know anything about British politics, and if you're going to be asked who is not going to be one of the leaders of the Leave campaign, you're going to say somebody who was born in Germany and raised in Germany, somebody who is a member of the Labour Party and was sent by the Labour Party to the European Convention. So from this point of view, we're talking about a very strong political personality whose choices, and I do believe one of the most important strategic choices that this generation of politicians in the United Kingdom did, is not easy to be predicted on the base of a kind of a formal biography. And this is why I'm extremely, extremely privileged to introduce Gisela Stuart. I do believe that you're here because you know who she is, and not because you don't know. But we're going to talk basically of the most important Labour voice when it comes to the Leave campaign, and also basically one of the leaders of Change Britain, which is the organization which is trying to go with this, with basically the change going on. Mr. Ultsch is not somebody that I should represent in Vienna. I do believe it should be the other way around. But we want to start just giving Gisela Stuart her 15 minutes to make a major argument and try to explain her position. And then we're going to have a conversation on the stage, and then we're going to go back to you for comments and questions. And thanks you again for being with us. So thank you very much. Gisela.
Well,
And let's tell you, because there is also one, because normally this was always the Institute for Human Sciences and the press only doing this. This idea about having a personalities on the base of which trajectories we try to do it, we still, and from our colleagues from Time to Talk, and we're doing this together. So also very happy to be part of it.
well, thank you very much indeed. Radio 4's got a program first thing in the morning at about 6:30, well 5:30 actually when I got up, where it does On This Day Today, a significant event happened. And on this day today, Winston Churchill finally retired, and Lord Carrington resigned on the principle of taking collective responsibility. So it's and I'm meeting you again, because the last time I met him, I led him astray in Krakow by telling him I knew the way around the church. Yeah. And I didn't, but you were very forgiving.
It's not easy to find a way to the church these days. Yeah.
Okay, how did we end up? My eldest son always accuses me. He says, "Mother, whenever I ask you something about Europe, you start with a history lesson. And by doing so, you frame the argument, which doesn't allow me to disagree with you." And I should try to avoid that, but I don't think you can not start with a history lesson, in a sense. But I'm going to try and do this in reverse order. If you were to say, I was a Blair babe. I was elected in '97 as part of the Blair intake in a seat which in 1938 was represented by a man called Neville Chamberlain. So I occasionally have these historic conversations saying to Neville, 20 years on, your seat will be represented by a German, a socialist, one born near Munich, but don't worry, it's all democratic. But if you were to ask me on what has been the most earth-shattering moment in your political life, it has not been the day when the resignation of the British Prime Minister was the third item in the news, i.e. the 24th of June 2016, when the 8 o'clock news ran on the basis that the country's leaving the UK, the stock markets are about to crash, and by the way, the Prime Minister has also said he's packing it in. Actually, it has been the events since then, because I cannot remember any other time since the introduction of the suffrage where the political elites have refused to accept the outcome of a vote. It may also be the first time that the political elites have been defeated in a vote. But up to now, my experience has always been that occasionally you have an election. 1992, the country woke up on a Friday morning and was going, oh my God, we've got the Tories again. And arguably the 97 election was won 5 years later because people were going, we really didn't mean this to happen. 2010 in the United Kingdom. United Kingdom has a first past the post electoral system which does not have coalition governments, certainly not the way you would have them on continental Europe. 2010 we have an inconclusive election. Cameron goes into coalition, we have Lib Dem ministers, and nobody goes around and saying, oh no, we have to have another election. However, what happened with this referendum, which I thought was absolutely extraordinary, you had a 72% turnout. You had a 3.8% margin of the vote. You know, that's a proper margin. It's not like the Welsh referendum, which we had a few years before, on a 0.7 margin, on a 51% turnout, and nobody questioned it. But this one is questioned. And I don't think the challenge for the United Kingdom and for Europe is how we deal or how we negotiate Brexit, because that separation is going to happen. And we will make it work. The real challenge for the United Kingdom is that it is currently in a democratic framework which is quite shattered and broken. And that was so even before the referendum. I remember going to see David Cameron before he called the referendum, together with a group of constitutional reform group. And he said to me a bit like Ian, he said to me, why do you care so much? Because I said to him, devolution in England outside London is seriously unfinished business. The reason why UKIP has risen is because England is asking itself who's speaking for us outside the cities, and you have not answered that question. UKIP is not about Europe, it is about devolution in England. And he kind of, and I said, you're going to be the Prime Minister of a fractured country, irrespective of what happens on the referendum. So you have to understand the British referendum decision as a logical consequence, I would see it, of the Maastricht negotiations in 1994. It's when Britain said we will not be part of the single currency and we will not be part of the free travel area. And in a sense, the actual introduction of the single currency then crystallized a tension that had always been there. And for me, and the answer, how does someone like me end up with this? If David Cameron had come back in after what he called his renegotiations and said, the European Union recognizes that we require a new architecture framework which says some countries will always be part of the euro and those countries will have to integrate more deeply with democratic checks and balances, with a banking union, with a fiscal union. It will have to have a finance ministry. It will have to do all kinds of things which sovereigns do, because only a sovereign can create money. And there will be other countries which are not. And it's not, this audience will understand the term, it's not the typical British extravert, you guys always sort of slight. No, there will be quite a number of other countries. I would have said, you know what? Let's give it a try. And that was my challenge. And I want to finish on a little anecdote about, you see, my epiphany, as some people would say, was spending 15 months in close company with Gisela Stuart, which those who have gone through this understand as a perfectly normal reaction to that experience. But essentially it was, I thought this institution can't change, but I was very happy to fall silent over that. But there was a debate in London where the then German ambassador, whose brother was the Spiegel correspondent, so the Matusek brothers, Thomas says to Matthias, what is it she's objecting to in this constitutional framework? And the other brother says, remember why the Bavarians never signed the Grundgesetz? And I was standing there saying, did the Bavarians never sign the Grundgesetz? He said, no. They thought there was too much power to the centre. They thought there was no way forward. And I said, but it was negotiated in Chiemsee. He said, yeah, but the Bavarians never signed it. And you can make of this what you want. I went back reading up and realized that you could say that rather than a good European German, I just reverted to deep Bavarian roots which had simply been transferred to a very receptive stock called the Brits.
Okay, we got it.
Yes, I to be honest, I was really surprised that the British voted like they have voted. For me, and I guess for most of the other observers, because we had this belief that in the end there will be a pragmatic decision, because it was clear for most of the observers, for journalists, for the elites, if you may call them so, that Britain would definitely be worse off economically outside the European Union. And you can see, I don't know whether you would share this observation, but you can see that there are troubles ahead, and that there are already economic troubles in the United Kingdom. I mean, the consumer confidence is down. In the first weeks or months, the pound went down, and so on. So why is it that these economical and pragmatic arguments in the end were not enough for the majority of the United Kingdom to remain inside the European Union? Why were those pragmatic arguments not enough to convince you?
Well, because for me, it never was pragmatism on that sense. I have a belief which I may well be proved wrong on, but I so firmly hold on to it that I'm happy to go to my grave being told you were wrong on this. And that is that functioning democracies produce economic success, not the other way around. That economic success will not produce you democratic structures. And I think the European Union was a construct which was trying to get away from ideology. And I can see why mainland Europe sort of felt, you know, don't give me strong people, don't give me ideologies, you know, they don't lead to anything good. And you were giving way on the absence of democratic structures, which to me ultimately is I can remove those in charge of me. If you can promise a better economic tomorrow. That was the deal. In exchange for better economic tomorrow, you created a bureaucratic structure that did not comply with my needs of checks and balances of democracy. And that was fine. And I keep coming back to the euro, but I will park that for a moment in terms of crystallizing it. But where I think what the British voted for, and you can, I am prepared to accept the charge that the referendum on both sides was fought not on a better tomorrow, but on a better yesterday. It's just that they used different time periods. The Leave campaign promised you a better yesterday circa December 1972, before we joined the common market. And the Remain campaign promised you a better yesterday circa Jacques Delors Commission 1987, which was truly a socialist, which gave them all the social rights which a Thatcher government wouldn't give them. Neither side gave a vision of the future. And that is a problem.
Isn't that irresponsible?
No, but just hold on. You have the same problem, if I may add.
Yeah.
That I think since 2008, we've had a shock to our systems across that we all have become terribly fearful of the future. And we suddenly got in a position, and I find it extraordinary, that everybody now tries to tell me that up until June 22nd, 2016, the world was perfect. But everything that's happening since is, by definition, must be worse because it is different from what June the 2nd, 2016 was. Well, the future may in some areas be different and not be so good, and in other areas it will be different and better. And by the way, all the problems on the euro, I mean, if I read in the Financial Times about Italian bank debts, and nobody wants to buy them at the moment. You know, the euro problems have not been solved. So
But
both sides will have to change.
You would accept the observation that at least on the short-term and mid-term range, Brexit will cause definitely economic problems for your country.
Well, if
so you would face this reality.
If you ask people for a generational vote and you make a generational decision, then probably you don't measure it by what's happening the next 6 months. See, what I found so extraordinary is that first of all, you talk to we had big companies who were saying the global flows of people, goods, and money are with us. In terms of goods, we have, GATT became WTO. The global system is adjusting to how you deal with that. In terms of money, we're trying to get to a system where we calibrate what happened in 2008, which had in no small measure an uncontrolled private flows of capital, which we hadn't seen since the 19th century. In flows of people, we are failing, and the European Union just thought you could solve the problem by outsourcing the borders to Turkey with lots of money, not solving the problem. So we are not adapting to, Europe wasn't adapting to them. And I think the United Kingdom has simply decided on some, they're going to try and forge their own way.
For me, it is amazing that obviously nobody really knows how to organize Brexit. Obviously, nobody really had an idea what is really.
But nobody's done it before.
What it really means.
Yeah.
So
Can I interfere? Because for me, this is the irony. And for the last 50 years of the 20th century, Britain basically had been negotiating with different types of former colonies that were becoming independent states. And this was basically about transition period, constitutions, trade negotiations. And it was always asymmetrical negotiations. All the expertise was concentrated in London, and all these new states basically have been hiring experts and so on and so on. Now, if you see from outside and you don't know anything, Britain ended in a position of its former colonies. Basically, when it comes to the negotiations on the trade deals, London is without experts on this and that, because the major trade negotiations have been done by the European Commission, and the European Commission has a very much asymmetrical influence. So paradoxically, my question is different. To what extent the vote, and I very much respect the vote, did not destroy the symbolic power of Britain? Because for a long period of time, there was a British mystique. Britain was perceived, in my view, as more influential, as stronger than it really was. And then suddenly, United Kingdom ended up as a normal country. And I'm interested to what extent you did not destroy with this popular vote what was the soft power of Britain.
You would be right if the loss of that soft power of Britain was caused by Brexit. I think it's the loss of soft power is a reflection of Brexit. And by the way, the loss of soft power comes back to Europe's loss. 2 weeks ago, I was reading a piece in the New York Times which said, your measure of true soft power is to what extent other people try and copy you. And he said, wasn't it interesting that for quite a number of years... Sorry?
You wrote it. Yeah, I wrote it.
Did you write this? Did I read the byline? So
I was sure that you did it by purpose.
No! and your argument was that China and Russia don't even try to pretend to be democratic. Am I right? Did I get this right?
Yeah.
So can you send me a copy? Because I didn't keep a hard copy. Honestly,
it was well organized.
Honestly, this was. But so even the European model of the democracy, whole power blocks aren't copying. You throw me off something. What was? Britain. You're quite right. You see, what I thought was quite extraordinary is the British foreign policy. Let's go back to 2001. so the European Convention on the Future of Europe happens. Tony Blair thinks that having reformed the Labour Party, having reformed the United Kingdom, he's now going to do that to Europe. The President of the Council of Europe was very much his idea that you needed construct in that structure, real deep engagement. And also the accession countries, when they were coming in up to 2004, their embassies tended to be, British embassy tended to be the Euro Commission office. The British looked after them during the convention, Bulgaria and Romania, all quite extraordinary soft power. And then what happens is the British, always not the best with foreign languages. We found it increasingly difficult to even find diplomats who could speak two foreign languages, which they would require to get jobs in Brussels. The Foreign Office budget, our pensioners get winter fuel payments. Is it £200, £300 once in winter? The British government spends more money on winter fuel payments than he spends on its entire budget of the Foreign Office these days. When William Hague became Foreign Secretary, I thought, well, if I have to have a Tory government, at least it'll restore the Foreign Office to its great glory. It became a wholly owned subsidiary of UKTI. We have, not only have we lost it, I think this is a challenge for a process of national renewal. And you can say, well, all these things you could have done within the European Union, absolutely right, but we didn't do them. Skills shortages, the UK got itself in a position that it thought that rather than long-term planning, you could just always say, well, people will come to London. That is not a I challenged someone, because you also referred to being a Labour MP. I did a debate in the Shard, which is that great glass building, so that the working classes really were out that evening. And someone said, how can you support Brexit, which means that we can no longer get anybody to look after our nurseries, after our hospitals and our old people's homes? That's what we need migrant labour for. And I said, are you trying to tell me that you're prepared to envisage a society that is permanently structured in such a way that our young, our old and our sick are not looked after by people who we pay well, who we train well, but think it can only be done by people who it's the best job they can get? That to me is not a sustainable society. So I think all of us are facing some really big questions as how we think our society should be run. And that's, in the UK, Brexit will be the thing which will force them to do it.
But isn't it ironic in a way that your former party leader and former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, how should I put it, somehow invited the so-called Polish plumbers to come to the United Kingdom, whereas countries like Austria and Germany insisted on, I don't know how long it lasted, like 10 years transition. 7 years transition periods. And in the end, the majority of your people woke up and said, oh God, it's too many migrants now. We're somehow afraid of them. We don't want them in. I believe that the migrant question was a very important factor in this election. But in a way, the idea of opening up your country and of getting this dynamic in your country was a Tony Blair idea, wasn't it?
Well, there's really three elements which I want to tease out on this one. The Blair one, actually I talked to someone last night who was a special advisor in the Foreign Office at that time, and because I said, why did we go down this road? And he said, you have to see that in the context of, this was sort of, 97, the great Blair landslide was that you could trust Labour with the economy. And businesses wanted that, and the 2001, 2002, 3 decisions have to be seen, and that Labour was still, Blair was still trying to say, you can trust us, we were probably listening to big businesses too much. But the migration, and for those who weren't involved, there's UKIP and Nigel Farage, who were not the official Leave campaign. If they had been the official Leave campaign, the referendum would have been lost. Vote Leave which was Boris Johnson, me, and Michael Gove as the leaders. In a sense, we were very careful what we said about migration. I never talked about numbers because that's not my argument. Was how can you plan for public services? You know, how can I plan for my schools? How can I plan for housing? How can I plan for all those things? But actually, I have no control of the numbers. So it was not the number, it was the fact that you have to plan it. And interestingly, some of the most unexpected Remain voters I found in the building industry who were telling me that they, compared to any of the English plumbers and brickies, you know, they thought the Polish were absolutely fantastic, to which then I again say, I have a real problem where if you've got an economy which operates on the fact that we take away from one country their brightest, their best and their most mobile.
That's how open societies work.
To some extent, but not to the extent when it diminishes. It is a balance. It is always a balance. You're quite right. You know, I love Bavaria. I mean, people have always gone, but it's a question of if it's economic need. And you know, we're here. You know, Germany saw this. You know, I grew up with the first guest workers in Germany actually were the Italians. Italians came and went, and the Portuguese, the Balkans. The first time you then had where that churning, which is normal, didn't happen, is when you had people coming from poor areas, which were the Anatolian Turkey, or in England it's the Mopuri Pakistanis, where it's not a question of movement, where you respond to just wanting to leave and economic conditions. But when it becomes an imbalance between those who have and those who haven't, then you have a problem.
But would you agree that migration was a decisive factor in this referendum? Also the context of the so-called refugee crisis, which peaked in that time.
Well, and you know, our inability to deal with global flows of people had pretty, you know. It has an impact in Germany. I think it had pretty much impact in Italy. It had an impact. You know, this is not a UK issue.
Yeah, just one question, because of course we'll go. But for me, this is also interesting because you started, and I very much agree with the fact that the relations between the people and the elites were very much changed as a result of Brexit, because you have a certain type of elite consensus. I don't mean only political elite, but particularly business and cultural elites. And then you have the people. But also there is one story which I found in the long term interesting for how Britain is going to rebuild its identity. And this is, you have the young generation that have been defeated on the referendum. Listen, in Bulgaria, in 1990, on the first post-communist elections, Bulgaria and Romania were the only two post-communist countries in which the opposition lost. One of the biggest problems for the country was that for the opposition was the overwhelming majority of the people under 40. And basically, the Socialist Party then won very much relying, it's not about only education, but it was particularly about age. So how you're going to believe that some of these people for whom the shaping experience was the loss of a referendum are going to build their identity as British voters, citizens, and so on. Because for me, this intergenerational politics is becoming critically important. And here, I want to provoke you to what extent you didn't kind of send the message to the youth that in a certain way, we like to talk about future, but it's not about your future.
I can't give you the answer, but let me take you to on that bit of the journey I've made on this so far, because I now chair something called Change Britain, and ahead of the 2017 election, we did 4,000 interviews, which a whole group of people, 2,000 before polling day, 2,000 after, and it was on a set of values. So it wasn't kind of who they're going to vote for. I was just trying to see where the coalitions were happening. And I could see where the coalition for the Corbyn almost getting to form the government were coming from. It was the Labour Party and that coalition was turning into something akin to the American Democrats. It was a rights-based public sector worker, university-educated city. Then I could see where May's vote came from. But then when I was thrown into confusion is when we separated this on age and we did the under 35s and over to 35s. And that it sort of became to the under 35s, essentially Corbyn's vision was ahead on every indicator. And the only group where Corbyn wasn't ahead was people over 50 who paid off their mortgage. So I was kind of thinking, where my trouble comes from is where the under 35s, Thatcher's children, who actually were self-reliant, didn't need the state, or where they're becoming very left-wing, who wanted the state. And what other thing I didn't know is to whether this was permanent. Having two children around that age group who just got married and have children, I kind of see them changing their tune quite considerably. No one's parenthood hits them. But then I was thrown into even more confusion by a conversation with a 35-year-old, works for KPMG, good income. And he said, no, you got this all wrong about the state. You've made such a mess of the state. He said, You've sold off the railways and they're not working. And you sold off the water industry and it's not working. And I'm not going to pay into pension because I've got no faith in it. And the reason why I have this emotional attachment to the National Health Service is because it's the only state institution I have any faith in. So I think there is what is happening out there, you're right, the young and the old, that relationship, but it's not going to fall along party political lines. I think there's going to be a real realignment of thinking about the future. The contributory principle is, you see, I thought they don't believe in the contributory principle, whereas they were telling me, saying, no, we just think you've made such a mess of it.
What is your, or what was, or what is your idea of the relationship of the United Kingdom with the European Union? Did you think about it during the campaign, or did you ask yourself this question only after the campaign?
No, I think it is important to knock on the head this notion that we didn't know what we were doing, and particularly this notion that. Which I was criticised of saying that you were just a useful idiot. You were kind of the foreign woman from Labour, and you were used. No, I mean I knew exactly what I was doing, and the reason why I agreed to chair it is because I knew that if you wanted to get a real assessment of this, you had to get out of that hole. That the only people who are Little Englanders and stupid and right wing are voting for that. So that's why I took a high profile role in that campaign. But to me, I had to go back to what I think was to me that Brexit is what was the unshackling of the basic decisions which I thought led to my definition of the lack of accountability. And that is why, to me, it is the four principles which were the key is that the European Court of Justice no longer has automatic supremacy. That does not mean, as some people say, oh, you're just going into the Wild West. Well, this is nonsense. WTO, all these kind of international rules are rules-based systems which you comply with, but none of them demand automaticity and supremacy without an ability to kind of go back on that. The second one is automatic payments into the budget. It's the automaticity of the payment, the third one was that you didn't just have control over your borders in terms of you could ask for a piece of paper, but if the United Kingdom Parliament wants to vote for free movement in the Commonwealth, they could do so. But it would be Parliament who decides as to where they do the differentiations. And the fourth one is you have to strike your own trade deals. If you don't strike your own trade deals, then you are no more than a Greater Norway.
But now you have to strike a lot of trade deals. Well, isn't that... It's a complicated stuff, right?
Well, my experience, life always is complicated. I mean, life is complicated for you
but
too.
one tends to make it less complicated than necessary.
You try, but it very rarely goes in. There's always this big historic debate, and we've got a few historians in here as to whether history is linear or whether it's sort of cyclical or things. But it tends to go in spurts, And I keep coming back. David Cameron asked the question, and in that moment, people like me, who would have, up to that point, said, let's see what you can do, but he failed to negotiate. He asked the question, and that was the only answer I could give.
So he shouldn't have asked the question, maybe.
Well, I think you should ask him that question.
But what do you think? Was it clever?
I don't know. I think, it was
for
the
his career, maybe it was not a good idea.
I always find it futile to sort of try and undo the past. But I think for the United Kingdom, Parliament itself has an enormous challenge ahead of itself. That something that is a fairly established parliamentary representative democracy is introducing a significant element of participatory democracy. And all the struggles we're going through at the moment clearly shows that the institution hasn't quite worked out how to deal with that. Because if you create institutions which are not established parties, if you create coalitions for the purposes of a referendum, which then by definition have to dissolve afterwards, you have that question of who is responsible for implementing the outcome. And this is why this is why the defeat of the elites is so significant here. Because they thought it wouldn't be a problem because they would get the outcome. Cameron thought he would win, and therefore it wouldn't be a problem.
We'll go for your questions to make the life slightly more complicated. But I very much agree with you on one thing. The fact that a classical parliamentarian regime like Britain went on referendum solving the issue, and particularly now where you have a different majority, de facto in the parliament and in the society, this is kind of putting the whole system into question.
And you know what the problem is? They thought, and because they thought Harold Wilson sort of got over the party divisions, I think there is a place for a nationwide referendum when it is about change of power relationships between the governed and those who govern. But when referenda are called because you can't resolve your party, internal party political differences, they don't have a happy history.
Yeah, true. So, please. And I know. So let's start with, they're two very important British voices. So, Ward Skidelsky first.
I never vote in the House of Lords.
I'd like to make two comments, really. First of all, I was a very reluctant Remainer because I did see the strength of the arguments on the other side, and I agree with a great deal of what Gisela has said. My two comments are, first of all, the question I'm sometimes asked, what would Keynes have thought of Brexit? And I think there are two things. First of all, he would have been very much against locking Britain into an economic structure which threw away so many of the tools he thought necessary for economic and political well-being. I think one's got to remember that the Keynesian system was devised as an antidote not just to communism but to fascism, which was, the other sort of aspiring extremist movement of the 30s. And one of the consequences of the way the European Union has been structured is, of course, the rise of populism of the right. So I think he would have been very much against being locked into a system as rigid a defender of a self-regulating market as the Eurozone was set up to be. Secondly, he would have actually not considered that the result simply as a political deal, but he would have thought that had a strong ideological component, a neoliberal component, and he would have been against that. He would have been, I think, pessimistic about the chances of overcoming it through further progress towards political union. He would have agreed with Gisela here that you need a state in order to make a market work. And if you don't have a state, there are going to be problems in the market which are going to destroy it, or at least subject it to very serious political threat. So that's the first comment I'd make. Second comment on migration. I don't think it's entirely or even mainly a product of a matter of Polish plumbers. I think one's got to recall the history here of very, very long-standing popular opposition to mass immigration. One has to go back to, say, Enoch Powell's speech in 1968, which got 80% support, but it was eliminated from politics, essentially. The parties got together. And somehow that's morphed into a sort of opposition to free movement within Europe, and it's taken an anti-Islamic form. And so the idea of controlling your own borders became very central, but that has a sort of quite a long history behind it. And I think the elites were terribly careless in their belief in their own power, in their disregard of those who consider themselves left behind and culturally and economically dispossessed in some way. Very, very careless. And they're paying the price. And one of the other things that emerged, which is very strong, is that the people who voted against European Union are not those who are in a position to carry out the consequences of that. The consequences of that vote are actually the responsibility of the elites who are against it. And that's the whole plot that's going on in Parliament, in the House of Lords recently, particularly, the belief that somehow or other one could reverse the decision. So, oh yes, well, we have to leave, but in such a way that it won't look like leaving.
Yeah.
One more, because I want to have also,
yeah.
because we're really very privileged today, because we have also one more very important debate from the British side. It's Anthony Barnett. So.
Yeah, well, I feel very torn, because I think that Gisela is a true Democrat, and her revulsion from the European constitutional process, I mean, is both genuine and justified. But it is also the case that, that's the first thing. And the second thing is that the British elite, which she has criticised, which is now taking the form of her colleagues Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, and so on, have been utterly reckless in the way they have governed the United Kingdom, and we are now eating the fruits of what they have sown. But the other aspect of this is that Brexit is not going to work. It's not going to work in part for the very reasons you have described. This is a society in breakdown, and it is not a society capable of taking on the immense challenge of Brexit. And so in one simple aspect of this is that it is not possible to leave the European regulated space. We can negotiate a different relationship with it, but fundamentally the drive, the psychopathological drive of Brexit is a democratic freedom, and that, to be free of all that. And we can't be free of all that, nor should we wish to be. We should wish to become a normal country. This is the point that Ivan has made. And Brexit is not a form of normalization. And secondly, it is dishonest in this sense, well, in two senses, it seems to me. One is that the genuine Brexiteers who were willing to pay for democracy, it wasn't an economic argument. It's very clear the economic argument was won by the Remain campaign. People did not vote for economic reasons. But the leadership, the elite, did exactly the same thing as they have done over the last 30 years, which is to say, it will be fine. When you began, you said Brexit will happen and it will be fine. It won't be fine. It is a big cost. If you want it to work, you must pay for it. And the unwillingness to say, blood, sweat and tears, this is what it is about, means that Brexit is now being engaged in not just by the elite who are against it, which Robert Skells is one, but by its own leaders in bad faith. I mean, I've heard Boris Johnson, be of good cheer, everything will be fine. You know, and if he'd said, it's going to really hurt, but it's worth it, then you would have a principled argument. You were close to saying that. So it's dishonest about migration. I mean, your campaign, one has to say this, you published the most terrible pamphlets on Turkey, maps of Turkey, saying Turkey will join the EU and our borders will be Syria, and great arrows, you know, sort of pointing to a million Turks will arrive. And Boris Johnson, people say, well, I had nothing to do with it, I complained, but you were told by Cummings, there's a clear history of this, you have to back this, and you did back it. So you are part of that Farageist thing, and that's another aspect which I feel won't work. And I think it's not that, you know, our fate is to try to democratize Europe together with Europe. And in that sense, you know, what we are looking at now is very deep. And the last thing I would just say is this. You mentioned, you said to Cameron, your people in England are not represented. Now, this is a distinction which the people here may not have heard or registered. Brexit, as well as being the vote of the old, 80% of young women under 25 who voted for Remain, the generational gap is huge, was also an English vote. England without London voted by an 11% majority. Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales was a tiny majority for Brexit of 80,000 people. It's an English nationalist vote. And that's another reason why it won't work, because Britain, the Great Britain that Brexit is supposed to represent, of Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, it wasn't a vote of the United Kingdom. It was a disuniting vote at its heart. And many people who are English are perfectly willing for the Scots and the Irish to leave. Fine, they can go. You know. But that's not what Theresa May, and it's not what Boris Johnson, it's not what Michael Gove want. So you're dealing with you fed an English nationalism which does lack democratic representation. But we should have dealt with that as part of the European Union, and not by trying to present a magical solution of leaving.
I want to come back. I mean, we could go on for the whole evening fighting the referendum and what we should have done in the past. We didn't do it. And joined the Constitutional Reform Group where we actually say how we dealt with things. But I want to do head on. I don't know what Keynes would have said, but I would recommend that everybody reads Mervyn King's Alchemy book. And there's a bit in there. Alchemy is the ability to create money, and you require money. And there's a bit in the book in there where essentially he says the real challenge we've got at the moment is trying to square this triangle of competing needs, which is to create, for the alchemy of money, you require sovereign. You require the requirements of democracy, and you have the requirements of international trade. And there are the massive tensions, and that is what the Brexit debate will be all about, as to which bit we'll have to give. In terms of Turkey, can I just say to you that at that time, my nightmare was that David Cameron would get up and say, I'll exercise my veto. He could have killed, because at that stage, we were still paying towards a 3.5 billion budget, which was working towards Turkish accession. It was stated UK government policy, and he did not. Well, it's no good shaking your head. He didn't, did he? And we paid towards the 3.5 billion. So, but where do we go from here? That is the real question. Because quite frankly, as a politician, now that I'm no longer an MP, I could go home and just say, it's just not going to work, is it? Well, sorry, that's not how the future is shaped. And just to, the predictions about the future are hard to come by, but I tell you one thing, during the whole campaign, people were saying, you vote for Brexit and the United Kingdom will break up because Scotland will have another referendum, the SNP will win. What happened in the 2017 election? The SNP lost seats to the Tories. Nicola Sturgeon is no longer talking about the second referendum because she knows she wouldn't win it. And the United Kingdom is not breaking up, but you did have a realignment of politics in Scotland. The Labour was the dominant force in Scotland. In 2010, they got destroyed, absolutely destroyed. The entire Scottish representation was down to SNP, one Tory, one Labour, one Liberal. What happened in 2017? It realigned alongst the lines of nationalists and unionists, and the unionists were represented by the Tories. Farage didn't want to win this referendum, by the way. This was part of my biggest problem. Farage wanted to be so disgusting that people wouldn't vote to leave because he wanted to lose the referendum by 0.5%, because that would have kept his existence and his role in life. And his driving force, he wanted to do to the Tories in England what the SNP had done to Labour in Scotland. And you're right, there's a kind of realignment of the politics. But you're a member of the House of Lords. You've got to vote in the House of Lords. Are you telling me that in the House of Lords you're just going to say, oh, can't be done, can't be done, can't be done?
That's what most of the speeches were about.
Well, in that case, their lordships should remember why they're drawing £300 a day. It's not to sit there saying can't be done.
But it should have.
Yeah.
Well, but it wasn't.
Please, we are going for the next round of comments and questions.
Madam, may I ask you the announcement here of this wonderful meeting is Europe. May I ask you, when the next government will be a Labour government, and I think that's nearly true, what is your picture, what is your vision of Europe inside your Labour Party? That's the first part of the question. Secondly, do you have in mind that Winston Churchill inspired and started with his wonderful Switzerland speech in 1945, the big idea of Europe? And then Edward Heath applied successfully, as you know, from Salisbury, for membership in the European Union. And then I may remind you that Margaret Thatcher, like you, asked then, where's my money? I want to have my money back. And I missed here that it's not mentioned the unbelievable idea of Europe here. Because 500 million people now are together with problems. If there are 500 people there together, it's sure that you will have a lot of problems. But there is one spirit in them. And do you think, or you have been astonished about the fantastic solidarity by European Union after the Salisbury attack by Putin and the unsolved murders of a lot of Russians in England? So may I ask you this two parts of the question? And at the end, I just want to make the comments that I served as a GP within the NHS for nearly a decade. And when I was asked by people here and in the northern, more German, and I said to them, for me it's sure that the Brexit will come. When you are arriving at Stansted Airport with a wonderful Ryanair, nearly years, week after week, and when you see there, I saw it, and I've been in Birmingham, I've been in Newcastle, I've been in Sunderland, I've been in the south, in the very rich parts of south, Hildenborough, Kent, you know it, yeah? 1 million buildings there for a family. Then was for me very clear that a normal English family will vote for Brexit. And when I saw the situation in your wonderful NHS, billions of pounds investment there, and very simple. You have not enough nurses and you have not enough doctors. So that will be all problems. And here I will tell you, please not thinking too much on money. Please think in this situation in Europe that we are solidarity We are Europeans. And that is a fantastic result of history of 70 years after the Second World War. And that I mentioned that as a German, proud that I am now a European citizen. So, madam, please, in your party, created by Bevin, the wonderful NHS, please think on this wonderful European Union idea.
Okay, can I recommend a book to you? It's written by a guy called Paul Lever, and he was the British ambassador to Berlin at the height of Blair's pro-Europeanism, and it's called Berlin Rules. And it is, to me, the best explanation as to why Germany feels so comfortable within the European Union structure, and why it's existential to its post-war definition. And his final paragraph says, in 20 years' time, those who voted to leave will wonder what all the fuss was about, and those who voted remain will not find anything wrong with the way Europe's developed. Read that. But what I want to challenge you on is, I resent your use of word Europe. Because what you're talking about is what I would call the Union. I have a school book, Bayerischer Schulverlag, copyright 1956, where it says, the United Kingdom is undoubtedly European, es ist Teil des kontinentalen Shelves. And then it goes on about the Industrial Revolution. My Europe, I grew up with, went from Dublin to the Urals. And then there's a Europe which is the Eurozone. And then there's a Euro of the Schengen zone. And then there's a Europe of all kinds of other things. And I resent this putting together of the word Europe, which sort of makes it sound like the Swiss are as European as you and I am, and the British will as European. And also the other thing to remember, post-World War II security, the deal was the EVG, the European Community, would provide economic stability, and NATO would provide military stability. So I would expect that whether it's in terms of security with the Five Eyes, the United Kingdom will be a provider of intelligence. We will be... May I just mention the 2% defence spending of NATO countries? The Britain will continue to spend that and provide the troops. On that level, I think it will continue to work. And you know, speaking as German to German in a sense, there's this thing called Königswinter. It's a conference which has been meeting since 1952, I think. It meets 1 year in Germany and 1 year in the UK. And I've been on the steering committee for the last 20 years. And actually, if you wanted to create a real row between the Germans and the Brits, you didn't mention Europe. Europe we could talk about, it was fine. You mentioned Russia. And my mighty, how do you relate to that? And, the challenge, you're quite right for the British, but may I say there's a challenge for Germany, because coming back to the Mervyn King book, if the euro requires a sovereign, well, either Germany says we are the sovereign and we underwrite it, or you require some structures which is the sovereign. And Germany will have to get to the point, and I think it is very strongly, I think that new generation of diplomats is really very brilliant, that they realize that Germany cannot go on to be an economic power and not also start to take a foreign policy responsibility. That's going to be very interesting. And so I'm as European as you are, whether the UK is in the Union or not.
I'll go for all the questions we're going to pick up, but don't try to avoid the Corbyn question.
Oh, the Corbyn question is a really tricky one for me, folks. I am many things, but I'm... Okay, you may think you can't explain Brexit. I can't explain Corbyn. In the days when I'm not a natural rebel. The only area where in my 20 years of parliament I tended not to vote with the government was after I came back from the convention on matters European. And we have people, the whips, who sort of, the Geschäftsführer, who have to check who's voting. And you always have to tell your whip beforehand whether you're going to vote or not. I always tried not to vote against my own side. Quite often I would just go home, and we had a code. I would text the whip and say, washing my hair tonight, and he goes and says, good. In other words, I would go home and not vote on this. But on the occasions when I did vote against their own side, and it would have the word Europe in it, it was a small group of people. And they always included Jeremy Corbyn. This is one thing I wouldn't even want to predict. I cannot explain to you the rise of Jeremy Corbyn as the leader of the Labour Party. It's not a Labour Party I feel as at home in as I did under Blair. And I hope that one day I will feel very at home in the Labour Party again.
Please.
Thank you. Let me ask a question from a different perspective. I'm not British. I'm Dutch, and I have also Croatian citizenship. Now, I want to ask you, did you think why UK voted this way? Why? And why not the Dutch? The Dutch are very pro-European. They wouldn't think of leaving Europe or European Union. They were absolutely in a similar situation. They lost their colonial empire. They had a lot of migrants coming from the former colonial empire. They have a lot of migrants from Turkey, from Morocco, from Poland, etc., etc. But they would not think of leaving European Union. And now the question is, could it be that UK did not do the necessary reforms which the Dutch did? Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was also a question there. Yeah, thank you.
But before the gentleman sits down,
Yeah.
can I just ask you something? So why did the Dutch and the French voted against the Constitution?
Sorry?
The Dutch voted against the European Constitution. Remember, when the European Constitution was drafted, there was an article in there which was an expulsion clause, which said any country which would not ratify the Constitution within 2 years would be asked to leave. And that clause was put in by Gisela Stuart because he thought it would be the Brits who wouldn't ratify the Constitution. And it was that clause which became Article 50, by the way. But then they had a referendum in France, and the French voted against it. And then they had a referendum in the Netherlands, and the Netherlands voted against it. And after that, nobody dared to have another referendum.
Anyway, the Dutch did not leave. And
Well, because nobody dares to ask them anymore.
they do not want.
Yeah, please.
Thank you. So I'm Austrian with family in UK, so I have parts of British origins too. And so I've been following this whole process of Brexit vote and what happened afterwards very closely. And so I'm naive, I'm no economist, I studied theater. What shocked me, of course, I was also shocked by the result. But what shocked me also is that there were, in the Leave campaign, obviously a lot of false fact or lies presented to the voters. And to me, it was a very populist campaign, a campaign that was not really based on facts, but on emotion, like this red bus going on with Boris Johnson will give the NHS 300 million a week, and so, which is clear. I mean, I think this is not a democratic process. So if democracy, it's fair to have a vote about this, but it should be based on real facts, on pros and cons, pros and contras, and not on this like emotional or really misleading arguments that the Leave campaign had. And now again, since 2 weeks, or I think 2 weeks where this Cambridge Analysis scandal came out. So my question is, how do you think of this now? And wouldn't it be fair now with all the knowledge, what has gone wrong? There has been manipulating in this process of voting. And wouldn't it be fair to do a second referendum on really based facts? These are the facts we have, these are the advantages we have of the European Union, these are the figures, this is what we pay in, this is what we get back in subsidies, so that even simpler people and not the elite can understand what the European Union really is, what is the advantage to be in, what is maybe the advantage to be out, and then have a fair vote for everybody, which is based on facts. This is, I think, more democratic than the vote went out. So this would be my question, how you see this now. And my second question is a more personal, if I may. As a German and growing up in German, and I don't know if I'm right that you moved now back to living in Germany, would you argue the same way for Germany to do a referendum and with the same argument that you now had for Brexit?
Tell me, why do you think I've moved back to Germany?
I don't know. I think I read it. That's why I said I'm not. I don't know if I'm right. Maybe I'm misguided.
So we're having a bit of a false fact here. So
yes,
you've just
exactly.
got up
Then I'm sorry, but then I'll ask you, just as a German and growing up in German and well being based also in that and knowing the situation in Germany very, very well. Would you do this? Would you argue in the same way or going forward in the same way for Germany?
Well, can I start by something? I've become something of an expert in hate mail. The most vicious and nasty hate mail came in German, from Germany. I mean, they had a special quality. And if there's a special place in hell for some of them, I recommend it to them. On facts, if the bus had said, we spent, what does it exactly say on the bus? As we're on facts, can you just repeat to me, what did the bus say?
Yeah, I think, this red bus where it give the NHS, we pay such and such per week in the...
Okay, shall we start by sticking to the facts, which said...
I could Google it now.
Yeah, I've stood in the bus often enough to sort of say...
120...
We send £350 million a week to the EU.
Yeah,
I'd rather spend it on the NHS.
Exactly.
If the figure... Okay.
Exactly.
Why don't we? It was a suggested question.
Yeah, well, why? But let's come back. If the figure had said 400 million, it would have been wrong. Actually, it's right. It's 300.
Figure, right?
Okay. Let's rewind. So it's a gross figure. It actually was 372 million. About a year later, I sat in an embassy lunch in the German embassy with Lionel Barber, the editor of the FT. And this was the night before they were running the story about how Brexit bill will be 100 billion. And he said, this we're going to run tomorrow. And I said to Lionel, is that a gross figure or a net figure? He said, it's a gross figure. I said, so the 350 million in the bus were okay. And he just turned his back to me and refused to speak to me for the rest of the evening. On facts, what happened to Osborne's emergency budget? And the families would be £4,853 worse off. The Leave campaign was allowed to raise £7 million from donors. We were allowed to raise that. Before the referendum was called, the government spent 9.2 million on a leaflet sent to every household. I mean, we can revisit the thing. What is clear is not just the conduct of referenda in terms of parliamentary democracy, but in terms of spending and things. But can I just urge you of one thing in terms of information? In my experience of having fought elections over 20 years, the electorate may be very inarticulate at times, but do not think they are stupid. You know? They
are manipulated.
You
did it.
So if Osborne's punishment budget and Obama's intervention had worked, then they would not have been manipulated. It's because you don't like the outcome that you think it's manipulated. At every election, people will make decisions on a whole base of things which are rational, irrational, and what have you. But please, let's not go down this thing of saying this particular one, because you didn't like the outcome, the electorate were too stupid.
No, I didn't absolutely want to point on that. I never think an election is stupid. I think it earns, it's only, because it is not stupid, it earns to have real understandable and facts, yeah, that that anybody can compare, because as you also know, after the Brexit vote, the most Googled word was European Union. So obviously there is a lack of knowledge about that, and I think because electorate is not so stupid, they should have real valuable facts they could compare and it shouldn't have been just a yes/no question, but okay, it's not because I do not like the outcome, that's fine, and I said it's fair to have such a referendum, but also what about the Cambridge Analytica things with the manipulation?
Yeah, explain to me, what do you think Cambridge Analytica did in the UK in the UK referendum?
Well, it was the campaigning of this Facebook data and sending
in the Trump election, and if you look Zuckerberg at the moment, but what? No, you're making a charge at me. Tell me now.
No,
what
I'm not
did?
making a charge.
No, come on. What did you think Cambridge Analytica did during the referendum?
It sent, like in the Trump election, it was used in the same way to go to the.
We know they did it for Trump. I mean, you see, the reason I'm challenging you so is that you're challenging me with the charge of unfounded facts and emotion, but you challenge me with a set of unfounded facts and emotions. So I'm just trying to get an equivalence here.
It's asymmetric. You won.
Oh, so therefore it was wrong. Oh, right, okay.
No,
Actually,
but
so you have actually just put your finger onto it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
let us come to this question, which is often raised, I guess, even more often raised in the rest of Europe, and not as often in the UK. I think it's wishful thinking, but do you think that there is any probability that there could be a second referendum? I do not ask you whether you wish for one or just whether you think.
The thing which I find, you're really playing with fire here. And I was trying to address that at the very beginning of you. I think democratic structures are pretty fragile. And they're fragile everywhere, Why did Germany have a grand coalition? Because the two major parties were terrified of another election, the AfD having even more votes than it last time. I don't need to tell you how finely balanced things are here. Look at the election result in Italy. I think democratic structures are. So if you go in a system and you have a referendum with a 72% turnout and a clear majority, then you could have one which would say, do you want no deal or this deal? But we are leaving. But one which said, dear voter, do you think you got it wrong last time? Quite, because however you would phrase the question, that's how it would be perceived. Not only would you have an even higher leave vote, but I think you would have undermined the institutions of your democracies irrecoverably. Because I go back to why did the British voters accept in 2010 a coalition government? It's because they had a faith in the institution. They may have absolutely no faith in any of the current incumbents. They may think the whole current lot, whether it's in the green end or the red end, is a whole bunch of charlatans. But you know what? They can get rid of them. And they sometimes take a deep breath and say, whew, didn't like this lot, have the other one. We need to be careful. I think all of us have to go through a process of, if you believe in democracy, and the rest of the world is not going our way. Read Ivan's article.
This was a good final, but I'm going to ask one more question. And the question is the following. I agree very much that, first, the voters are not stupid, and we should not overplay this Cambridge Analytica. Micro-targeting was used by all parties. David Cameron used to have a nudged unit in the government, which is very much the same story. The story is different, and my question is going to be like this. People voted because they trusted people like you. Even Boris Johnson and so on. It's not that people are getting the information from nowhere. They're looking to certain type of political leaders, And they took a lead. They said, I'm much more ready to trust Gisela than I'm going to trust basically Cameron or somebody else. At what point you personally are going to have the feeling what should happen to believe that I was wrong to lead them there? It's not about Brexit in principle, but if you're going to look back on the what kind of conditions of the development of the United Kingdom, you're going to say, I feel guilty that I let my people going this way.
When the referendum happened, my original plan was that, and I said at the beginning, that I told both Boris and Michael that I'm an opposition MP. It's the government which owns the result, whatever the result is. And I also assumed that there would be a general election in 2020. And in 2015, I had decided, I'd done 20 years in a highly marginal constituency, you know, kind of, there was a bit of, I want my life back. I didn't even want to do the referendum. It was a kind of, it was actually David Owen. You know, David Owen was Labour's youngest foreign secretary who left the Labour Party over what he thought was an anti-European view of the Labour Party. He founded the Social Democrats, but David Owen campaigned to leave. And so it was David who took me to a corner and said, you're a politician, you can't bail out of this one. So, and my view is if you don't do something, you take a leading role if you can, if it serves a purpose. But I had, so the referendum happens. The thing which surprised me more than anything else, I thought there would be a fallout. I thought there would be divisions because families voted in different ways. And the reason why we set up Change Britain is because I wanted to bring Leavers and Remainers together. I did not think that it would continue to be quite as polarised. At the moment, the polling shows us that 30% of the British population still wake up in the morning and they sob their pillows wet on the basis of how could this have happened. 30% are saying out. I really don't care anymore what's out. And the 40% in the middle just say, haven't we left yet? I am so bored with this update. I just can't bear to hear about it anymore. And this is not shifting. Similarly, we were doing research on, you know, was there buyer's regret? What it showed us is the project fear worked. And there were anything between, probably up to 10% of what we called reluctant Remainers. They were very content with the outcome, but they voted Remain because they sort of thought, on balance, it was too risky. We also did research on the 350 million and the red bus, by the way, because I sort of said, if that was a significant factor on the vote, then that has a significant implication for how the government responds to that. And it wasn't the thing. The reason why Theresa May is now putting more money in there has got nothing to do with the red bus. It's because it's the only state institution UK PLC still collectively believes in. And that's why she needs to save it. I did not anticipate that Boris and Michael would stab each other in the back. I did not anticipate that Theresa May would call an early election in 2017 for which the electors punished her. So there were all kinds of things which I genuinely did not anticipate. But rather than having retired, which was my plan when the election was called, and go back to my wonderful garden and my woodlands and my badger set, I'm still doing politics because I do feel I have, until we actually leave, I have a residual responsibility to help that outcome. And I can do that in a way because I have no skin in the game anymore. I don't need to take, I can broker and things, but I have no doubt that the changes which have to happen on both sides is something which is going to be difficult for both sides, but it was the right thing.
Why did you leave Parliament?
Because my thinking was, if you have never fought a marginal constituency like I have for 20 years, I didn't know what a weekend, which was more than 20 hours, was. You know, I thought 2020 I would have turned 65. I would have done 23 years. Time to go, and it took me about 9 months just to get out of the drumbeat of, you know, Friday night. I go home these days and I go, Friday night?
time to go to the Lord.
Friday night, I could actually be up. There are already enough of you up there. So that was the thing. But I do have a sense of responsibility, which is why I'm doing things like here today, because I think someone needs to make the case which is not Nigel Farage.
Thank you very much. And we are very grateful that you are not staying in your garden and you have been talking to us. And we are really, I'm sure that there's going to be a political biography of you being written in some years. We can argue what is going to be the title, The Bavarian Who Rescued Britain, or The Bavarian Who Destroyed Britain. But I'm sure that they're going to be a great political biography. It was a great pleasure to have you here.
Thanks a lot.